Today on Practical Church Planting, 3 benefits of shortening your sermon.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Androsian, and joining me is Dylan Dotson, and today we're talking about 3 benefits to shortening your sermon.
So there's this kind of belief in preaching world, ministry world, especially people that do preach, that longer is automatically more spiritual.
Of course.
And I just kind of think, and I think part of that is, especially like if you're a newer preacher, you think that people that preach longer must know a lot, because how else could they go for 45 minutes or an hour?
Right.
And so then you think that you have to do this way, and it comes like, this is like unsaid rule of like, if you don't preach a certain length, then you're not good enough.
Well, sermon length is directly correlating of how good of a Christian you are, right?
Yes, and how much you know.
Right.
So anyway, there just seems to be, people like like I said, assume longer is better. And I remember about 9 months ago, part of this cohort, church planting cohort that I was part of, it was really helpful and really enjoyed the guys I was with. And one of the times we were talking about preaching, and we went around and asked about how long they preached, and everyone was saying their thing. I was the shortest, or maybe tied for the shortest, and I said try to keep it to 30 minutes, maybe 35. And I was one of the last ones to go, and I remember people thinking saying what?
Right.
And the guy who said the longest, one guy said he goes for about 55 minutes. He was the most like, no way. And no one was being mean about it,
Right.
but they were like shocked, like, why would you only preach? That's kind of the vibe I got. Like, why would you only preach for 30 minutes? Don't you have more to say? Don't you know how important this is? And,
right.
And so I've thought about that a lot, because again, there's this assumption that you have to go longer. And then yesterday on Twitter, a well-known preacher wrote an article that said why you should shorten your sermon by 5 minutes. And I was like, yes. And he was talking about some of the things we're going to talk about. And then another well-known preacher from the more traditional world also tweeted that he, over the past few months, has been intentionally shortening his sermons by about 10 minutes.
Wow.
And I think he said he's been trying to go between 32 and 35 minutes, and has seen an increase in engagement and people applying and understanding and learning what he's actually trying to say. And again, I said yes.
Yeah.
Because there's a misconception that longer is better, and we're going to tell you why today. Longer is not always better. So
I can't wait.
Number one of the 3 benefits of preaching shorter sermons. Number one is it keeps people engaged. Right. It keeps people engaged. Like, the longer you go, the less likely you are going to keep people's attention.
Yeah.
And this is important because why? You want people to actually learn what you're saying. You want people to actually take away what you're saying. And when you're going longer and longer and longer, well, people stop paying attention, especially if they're not engaged with what you're saying and if you're rambling and all those sorts of things.
True. I mean, we live in a world of short attention spans, and that's kind of just the way things are. You can fight it and try and pretend like it doesn't exist, but it does.
And what's interesting was that what the guy who said that he's cutting his down by 10 minutes and about 32 to 35 minutes, someone said, is that contextual? And yes, to a degree, this is kind of more Western contextual, but this guy has preached quite often all over the world. And he said, even in other parts of the world where they want to be taught and learn a lot of things, and maybe don't have access to the things that we have access, he said, I've also experienced, even in those circumstances, that people they don't necessarily want you to go for like longer than an hour. They just want to have they want to hear you speak multiple times or have multiple sessions with you.
Yeah.
So he said, even then, it's like they're not necessarily wanting you to go 2 hours. They're just wanting to have more time to hear what you have to say. And again, a lot of times we try to make this spiritual. And yes, the Spirit and God can do whatever he wants to do, however he wants to do it.
Right.
But part of the way that we give people transformation and teach them the Bible is they have to be engaged. Like, if someone's asleep, like literally sleeping, and you're preaching to them, like, not saying, let's say it's nighttime and you go and you preach to someone who's asleep. Like, they don't hear anything you're saying. Why? Because they're completely disengaged. Now, people are probably, although maybe sometimes they fall asleep, most people aren't falling asleep, but if they're not engaged and they're not listening, it doesn't really matter how great you are or what you're saying. They're not actually listening to what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so while this is a benefit, is that it keeps people engaged. And if you want to, again, give them transformation and teach them things and let them understand God's word better, they have to be engaged. And if you're going for 60 minutes, they're not engaged.
Yeah, and I think, we're, as a preacher, you're pretty different than the people you're preaching to. But even most of us, it's hard to stay engaged to just one person or one thing for a super long period of time with no break, with nothing else going on.
Because
no matter how engaging.
Right, and again, we're not preaching to seminary students; we're preaching to people. And the funny thing is, I could name 5. On one hand, the amount of people that I want to hear speak 45 minutes to an hour.
Right.
Now, I'm sure there's more because obviously I don't know everybody. But very, very few people do I actually want to listen to speak that long, and I enjoy this stuff.
Yeah, and even if I think back to like conferences and things that we've been to that have probably people that are in that the 1% of communicators in the world speaking. Oh man, I mean, they don't ever give them like a time slot that's that long, because they know even though these people are great, most people just they have a hard time sitting still. I mean, if we're being real, people fidget, and it's just hard to keep someone's focus for that long.
Yeah, so that's the first benefit. Number one, keeps people engaged, which is very important. Number two, maybe even more helpful, I don't know if it's more important, but more helpful, is that it keeps you focused.
Yeah.
So the same guy who said he did this thread about how he was in response to the preaching the shorter sermons article, talking about how he's been doing this for the past few months. He even said that it's not that he's actually brought the same amount of content in his notes. So it's not that he has less content. He's just being, and he says he uses very few notes, and most of it is kind of on the fly as things come to him. But he said, knowing that I'm trying to keep it into a shorter time limit, it's making me be more precise and intentional with what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And when you're and even if you're not that way, even if you use a lot of notes, it doesn't matter. The point is, when you only have 30 or 35 minutes, which, I mean, put my cards on the table, I think that is a great thing to shoot for. Maybe even 25 minutes if you're inexperienced. I would say that's better than 35.
Right.
But if we do around the 30-minute range, which is what we do, I'm not saying it's the best, is what we do. If you only have that much time, well, you can only say certain things. Sure. And so you're going to be more intentional about what you're saying, why you're saying it. You're not going to go off on rabbit trails as much. And what this really means is that it takes more work.
Yeah.
A lot of times we think longer takes more work, especially if you're inexperienced. But what you actually find out the more you do it, shorter takes more work. Like a good, concise sermon that is applicable, teaches Christ, gives people something they can walk away with. It takes a lot more work to do that in 30 minutes than 50 minutes. Yeah. Because you could just share stories and go off on good rabbit trails and that sort of thing. If you only have a certain amount of time, you actually have to do more work.
Yeah. I think this is a really hard part because there's going to be stuff that you think is really cool, whether it's background to things or just things that you think would really add to it that you end up having to cut out. And I mean, been there. There's times we've been preparing where it's like, I just think that this is the coolest thing, and give people some context, and it's really a cool thing to include. But then when kind of thinking more about it, it really doesn't benefit, or there's nothing lost by not including it.
Right.
But it helps keep their attention, helps move things along.
And this is the hard thing, is we think, especially the more inexperienced you are, that you have to give people everything every time you preach. And again, that's great. I've been guilty of that. I had to learn a lot of all this stuff is interesting. They need to know all this and this, and it's like that is good to know. But if you just jam pack all this information in a 50-minute message, you're not going to be able to retain all of that. Yeah. That's just, you can see all the studies and that sort of thing. How quick people are to forget things. And so when you're giving way too much information and it's all not focused and it's all over the place, well, people just don't know what to take away. They don't know what to kind of learn, and so they kind of walk away not even really being able to tell you what the point of the message was. Now, that's not to say that I know there's people that work really hard and speak for 50 minutes and they try to be focused and that sort of thing, which is great. But again, when you're going for that long, it's just hard, not just to keep people's attention, but for them to know what you actually want them to know. And we're going to do a future episode on kind of the template that we use here at New City to help us stay focused and the importance of a bottom line. But the thing is, the longer you go, the harder it is for people to know, what do I want them to know? And the thing is, and what's important about this is that you want, it's better for you to tell people what you want them to know than for them to think of it on their own. And when the longer you go, it is harder for them to know, no, this is the most important thing. And so all that to say, if it keeps you focused, it keeps you explaining the important things, it makes you cut out things that aren't as important. And then I think people will appreciate it more, and not just appreciate it more, but they'll know what they're supposed to do with what they heard.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about kind of removing some of the or kind of trimming some of the fat, you could say removing some of the excess stuff. We're not saying you need to dumb things down, or that you have to make it so whatever. So it's almost boring to a person that's been in church for a long time because it's so basic. But like you're saying, I think it does take a lot of work to be able to trim it down, but still have good content. Yeah. It doesn't mean that you can't go into any detail or go into any background or kind of explain what words mean, but you need to do it in an engaging way and keep it concise and not spend a ton of time on it, but maybe touch on these things and then keep moving. Yeah.
Again, know what you're going to say, practice what you're going to say, and just don't go on all these rabbit trails that kind of take away from what you're trying to get at. So number one, keeps people engaged. Number two, keeps you focused. It makes you actually have to work. But if you're focused, people are actually going to know what they're supposed to take away. And number three, I don't know. I mean, this is just, if we're just being honest, is that this helps you be realistic about your ability. Yep. Let's just be honest. We're not in the top 1% of communicators. Everyone, we think we're great, maybe, or if we're being honest, we know we're not. And so, again, there's very few people that I would listen to for 45 to 60 minutes. And so when I hear, especially younger guys, talk about how they go for 45 minutes or 50 minutes or 55 minutes. I'm just like, you're not good enough. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that in a bad way. But again, if we want to let people know, if we want to engage people, if we want to be focused on what we're talking about, then we don't really need 45 minutes. Yeah. And I was also reading too, what's interesting about this is we might say, well, great preachers of the past preach 45 minutes or an hour. And that's true. But we also need to understand that we live in a different day and age. Yeah. So the day and age we live in now, people can read and write. So before, the Gutenberg press and, they couldn't even read. So like, that's all they could go to. Yep. And even after they could read, it's still like there wasn't podcasts and videos and all these things where you can get all this information. Like literally going to church and hearing a preacher was like the main time you ever like really learned information about the Bible and that sort of thing that you couldn't do on your own. Now there's so many of that stuff out there that it's not that we shouldn't preach long sermons and we shouldn't be good, but like we don't have to tell them everything. There's so much information out there. And so the day and age in which we live is just so different than even it was 50 years ago. Yeah, and so to compare what someone did 50 years ago in the context with they live to what we do today, I don't think it's accurate because it's just so different.
Yeah, I think this can come across as kind of an offensive episode, maybe if you're, if you're a person that does this. And I think a common thing would be to say, hey, but this guy preaches this long, or this guy, nowadays. And there are phenomenal communicators that do preach that long. I mean, I think we both say that those people do exist. But if we're being realistic, and I don't mind saying this because I'm definitely talking about myself too, and Dylan, we're not in that group. Yep. So using like these people that have been doing this for decades and that are in that 1% of communicators is kind of a defense of why to do it when we're just not there. Yep. And it's okay to not be there. That's not like a negative thing. Yeah. It's just, I don't think it's helpful.
Yeah. And so again, being realistic about your ability, and again, it makes people appreciate it. Now, this is only anecdotal evidence, if you will. And I know if you preach longer, some people could say that. So I'll take this with a grain of salt. But because we've always been 30 to 35 minutes consistently, I can't tell you the number of people have said, we really appreciate that you say what you're going to say in this amount of time, and we know what to expect. Because too, like I was telling Brian, I guess I'll go ahead and say this, we're growing here at New City Church. Has been, especially this summer, has been really awesome. If we had 45 to 60 minute sermons, I don't think we would be growing as we are. Either. And again, that's not dumbing it down. It's just that people know what to expect. It's easier to invite their friends too, because they know it's not going to be 60 minutes of their friend being like, what is happening here? Mm-hmm. And so again, this is practical church planning. So this is not like the theology or necessarily philosophy about why you should preach a certain way. Just in my experience, people are more engaged if you can keep it to around 30 to 35 minutes. You are definitely more focused. Right. And when you're honest about your ability, the funny thing is people will actually think you better than you are.
That's true.
Because if you go forever, they're going to be like, this guy is so boring. Yep. But if you don't go too long, they'll be like, oh, I could listen to him. Yep. And then they'll think you better than you are, and everything is better that way.
Yeah. And I think, honestly, people catch on if you're going much longer than kind of, maybe this isn't the right way to put it, but then your ability allows. Mm-hmm. If you're going much longer, I think people realize that. And I think that kind of comes across as like that you don't really have that self-awareness of, hey, I know I'm not as experienced, and that's why I'm keeping it a little shorter, because I don't want to, not to say everyone's boring, but because I don't want to bore you or something like that. I think people appreciate having that self-awareness.
And what's funny, so we launched about a year and a half ago. Yeah. And I had never, I've preached obviously before we launched, but never consistently on a weekly basis. So I didn't really tell people this because, again, this is a shame unless you preach like 45-minute sermons, at least you're not spiritual. But my goal in the beginning was 25 minutes. Yeah. I was like, I'm not good enough. And now I've pushed it to 30, 32-ish minutes is what I kind of go to. I feel like I've gotten better. But I was like, I'm not going to bore people, but I'm still trying to figure out how to do this thing well. Right. And I think that was probably good. Yep. In fact, they might have said 20 minutes would have been nice. Right. But anyway, so hey, there it is. 3 reasons why shortening your sermon, why there's benefits to that. Number 1, keeps people engaged. Number 2, keeps you focused. Number 3, let's be honest, it helps us be realistic about our ability, because the goal is to help people meet Jesus. And you could have a great 35-minute message, and then the last 5 minutes, because people are bored, you just lose it. Because it could have been amazing, but it was too long, and so people start to lose focus. And I've seen that happen as well. Yep. So,
and losing someone at the end, you pretty much lose the entire thing.
Yeah. So the end is that's real important. So hey, if you have any other questions about preaching or anything you want us to talk about in a future episode, practicalplanning.com/questions is where you can go to submit them. Yep. And we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planning. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planning. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planning, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planning on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.